Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you, and thanks for joining today's webinar about the economics of floating solar. We're here together today with Molly Cox, Research Associate at Wood Mackenzie, and she will do a presentation today about the economics of floating solar. Before we go to the actual presentation, there's a couple of things I want to mention to you. First of all, why are we here? This is a stat graph giving an overview of the floating solar markets, the 5 biggest floating solar markets on January 2019. And as probably all of you have noticed, there's a lot going on in the floating solar market, and this graph will look way different in January 2020. And that's also why, besides this webinar, we'll host the Floating Solar Conference on the 19th of September in Amsterdam. So that's in exactly 3 weeks from today. And we'll bring together 25 speakers and over 200 attendees. And we already have registrations from over 20 countries, from Brazil to India, even people flying in from Ghana. So it's a true global floating solar conference. And before we start, I wanted to mention a couple of technical details. Please, if you have any technical issues, use the chat box. If you have any questions, use the question box. We'll have a Q&A at the end of today's webinar. Molly, we're going to unmute you and hand over controls, and then we're going to start with the presentation.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Thomas. Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be here today speaking about floating solar and sharing some research we've been doing here at Wood Mackenzie Power and Renewables. We're also grateful to have this opportunity to partner with Solarplaza, and I hope to see most of you at the Floating Solar Conference in Amsterdam next month. Floating solar is a field that I'm very excited about, so I look forward to discussing some of the market trends and pricing information today with you all. So just to provide a brief background before we get started, Wood Mackenzie is an international research and consulting firm, and Wood Mackenzie Power and Renewables is the team that I'm a part of. So this part of the company formed as a result of Wood Mackenzie's acquisition of Make, a wind energy research and consulting firm, and Green Tech Media Research, a solar research company. And to start things off, I'll give a brief overview of the floating solar market as we see it and a global perspective, and then I'll jump into some regional trends and system cost breakdowns. I wanted to include this graphic from the report by the Solar Energy Research Institute of Singapore and World Bank that most of you might be familiar with as a helpful image just for a typical floating solar setup. Floating solar has been gaining a lot of traction as countries deploy more renewable energy sources. Broadly, floating solar is an attractive option for markets that face land constraints where large ground-mounted arrays are not possible due to high land costs, maybe difficulty in acquiring land, or unsuitable topography. So one of the advantages of floating solar is that these systems may be deployed on water space that would otherwise go unused, such as a flooded gravel pit or reservoir. I do want to mention that for the most part, the floating solar industry has seen installations on inland bodies of water, such as agricultural ponds, lakes, dams, reservoirs, water treatment facilities, water-filled quarries, and other industrial water bodies. There are still challenges and uncertainties to overcome with offshore floating solar. So even though there are existing offshore floating solar installations and recent announcements of future projects, I'll primarily be focused on inland floating solar when it comes to pricing later on in the webinar. I also want to mention that when I talk about floating solar projects being completed or looking at total installed capacity, I'm referring to projects that have either been completed with construction or commissioned, but they aren't necessarily fully commissioned. So more and more manufacturers are coming into the floating solar arena. Companies with transferable skills, like those who offer equipment for offshore wind or other marine activities, are getting into the space. So Wood Mackenzie expects more price competition as a result of this influx of new vendors. I'll get into pricing in a little bit, but part of the reason it's so difficult to standardize prices for floating solar applications is due to the variety of floating solar solutions out there. Each floating solar installation is already unique as is, and then the floating solar structure itself, which is the platform that the solar modules are mounted onto, can be very unique. So these vendors shown here all offer different floating solar structure solutions. And for example, there are solutions that include one large membrane that serves as a platform for all solar modules to be installed, while other companies may offer a different solution where the structure is made up of many pontoons that are linked together to support the solar modules. So far, we've seen two trends when it comes to floating solar structure manufacturer business models, and that includes vendors who supply a one-stop shop kind of service, such as SunGrow, which supplies their own floating structure, and inverters can also develop their own projects. And similarly, CL & Ter, a pioneer in floating structure manufacturing, supplies its own Hydrelio floating structure solution and also offers developer services. And then the other trend is for companies to focus on their core competency and stick to manufacturing just the floating solar structure or the mooring and anchoring solution. So within an industry with so much potential, and as project sizes increase, it's possible there will be more announcements of larger 500 megawatt to 1 gigawatt projects by 2024, which would contribute to more of a high case scenario for floating solar capacity through 2024. But a high and low case scenario for floating solar demand is heavily dependent on major markets, mostly in Asia, such as China, South Korea, Taiwan, and India. And some of the downside risk for floating solar adoption includes unanticipated high costs that occur post-installation, which might deter new installations from coming online. Another factor would be substantial projects such as South Korea's 2.1 gigawatt and other project announcements in Taiwan getting delayed. Another factor may be that the adoption of floating solar is slower than anticipated in India, for example, due to the steep learning curve of installing this new kind of application. But on the other hand, some of the upside for floating solar adoption may be that as more incentives for floating solar are created, this will help stimulate floating solar demand. And also costs may come down faster than anticipated, and there may be more large-scale project announcements, as mentioned previously. So in 2022, floating solar demand has the potential to reach just over 2% of global solar demand, largely due to the expected 1.2 gigawatt project in South Korea, which is part of the 2.1 gigawatt DC project being developed by South Korea's Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy. So it's also interesting to note that the average global floating solar project size has been growing consistently since 2015 with an average growth rate of 85% year over year, expected from 2014 to the end of this year, 2019. This growing project size is a contributing factor to increased floating solar capacity, and projects are expected to get even bigger in 2020 and onwards. So looking beyond 2019, the average global project size for tenders and project announcements in 2020 will be about 14 megawatts DC and will increase to 21 megawatts in 2021 and even 219 megawatts in 2022. By the end of 2019, 10 countries in the world will have a cumulative installed capacity of 10 megawatts or more of floating solar. China leads the charge with 1 gigawatt installed cumulatively, followed by South Korea with about 434 megawatts, Taiwan with 344 megawatts, and Japan with 216 megawatts. So while Asia will continue to lead the floating solar market in 2019 through 2024. The region's overall market share may decline about 2% year over year on average from 2019 through 2024, while Europe's market share will actually increase by an average of 24% year over year from 2019 through 2024. By 2024, it's possible that Asia will have closer to just under 80% share in the floating solar market, likely due to the increase in share from other regions such as the Middle East and Europe, and due to the decline in share that China and Japan may experience. The Middle East is actually expected to hold about 3% of global floating solar market in terms of installations in 2024, and Europe is expected to hold about 16% share that same year. The United Arab Emirates will likely lead the Middle East floating solar market with the announcement of a potential 60 megawatt floating solar array in Dubai. The exact completion date is unknown, but furthermore, the Dubai Electricity and Water Authority has shown a keen interest in floating solar and has issued a request for proposal to study the feasibility of floating solar in the Arabian Gulf. Dubai has a 2050 target to supply 75% of its power output from clean energy, and floating solar may help Dubai achieve this goal. Additionally, the Netherlands, which is expected to hold 73% of Europe's floating solar capacity in 2019 and will continue to lead the European floating solar market through 2024 expectedly, is expected to grow an average of 35% year over year from 2019 through 2024, which will contribute to Europe's overall increase in global market share. In 2018, the top 5 countries leading Asia's floating solar market were China, followed by Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and India. And South Korea will be the #1 leader in Asia's floating solar market in 2019 and is expected to hold 41% of floating solar installations this year in Asia. South Korea experiences land constraints, and acquiring land can be a complicated process, so floating solar presents itself as an alternative here. South Korea's floating solar demand in 2019 is primarily driven by larger projects, such as 2 100 megawatt projects and one 80 megawatt project developed by the Korea Rural Community Corporation. If the completion of these projects is delayed, then Taiwan is expected to end up as the floating solar market leader in 2019 in Asia, and Taiwan is expected to hold 34% of total floating solar installations in Asia in 2019, assuming that the 320 megawatt floating solar plant in Xinghua County is completed. Taiwan is also dealing with land constraint issues where land is prioritized for agricultural purposes, so floating solar is also an attractive option in this market. In 2018, floating solar installs in China accounted for 84% of global floating solar installations. China also hosts the largest floating solar installation in the world today, which is a 150 megawatt DC array in a coal mining subsidence area in Bingtai County in the Anhui province. And what's interesting is that at the end of 2018, about 78% of China's floating solar projects were installed in the Anhui province in eastern China. China's utility scale solar production has been primarily on the western side of the country due to the conducive desert environment for for solar production. However, China's population mostly inhabits the eastern side of the country, where there are also optimal bodies of water for floating solar. So while China tries to bridge this gap between solar production and the location of load, floating solar may actually help in this effort, given that most of the floating solar installs have been on the eastern side of the country. So while there are many market dynamics that contribute to China's annual solar demand decline in 2020, such as the shift to a subsidy-free scheme, floating solar in China will become an increasingly larger share of global demand from 2020 through 2024 in China, as you can see. China's demand, not global demand. Japan is another leading market in the global floating solar arena. At the end of 2018, Japan had a total of 115 floating solar installations completed. Japan has been one of the pioneers in floating solar installations with its first install of 20 kilowatts in 2007. So despite all these installations, its average project size expected through the end of 2019 will be 1.3 megawatts. So this is quite small when compared to other leading markets in Asia, such as China, who's expected to have an average project size of 23 megawatts by the end of 2019, and South Korea, which will have an average project size of 10 megawatts by the end of 2019, and Taiwan with an average size of 37 megawatts. So while Japan's largest project completed and commissioned in 2018 was 13.7 megawatts, most of its projects have remained smaller. Japan's floating solar market is primarily driven by the country's limited access to land for large ground-mounted arrays, higher land costs, and of course Japan's mountainous topography. From 2007 through the end of 2019, Japan's floating solar capacity has grown an average of 124% year over year. From 2019 to 2024, annual solar demand in Japan will decline at an average rate of 10% year over year, and floating solar is expected to follow suit. However, Wood Mackenzie expects floating solar to decline at a slower rate, at an average of 3% year over year. India will be another leading floating solar market in Asia in 2019 and through 2024, and is expected to be the third largest floating solar market in 2019 in Asia. The Solar Energy Corporation of India has set a solar generation capacity target for the country of 100 gigawatts by 2022. So India has high growth potential for floating solar as the country tries to achieve aggressive solar capacity targets. And the Solar Energy Corporation of India has issued many floating solar tenders as a result. India also struggles with limited land availability for larger ground-mount arrays, along with high land costs and lengthy process to acquire land. So floating solar may be necessary in order to achieve more widespread floating solar or widespread solar adoption in India. The country has well over 1 gigawatt of tender announcements for floating solar. However, the country also has a history of tender delays and even cancellations, which may yield to lower floating solar capacity than predicted. But having said that, while India's market grew 144% on average year over year in terms of floating solar installations from 2014, its first floating solar installation, through the end of 2018, the country has the potential to more than triple this growth rate year over year from 2019 through 2024. So far, the largest announcement for floating solar in India is for a 250 megawatt system in Tamil Nadu, and the completion date remains unclear. But what's interesting is at the end of 2018, the majority of projects in India were installed in the southern and eastern parts of the country, such as Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, and West Bengal. However, unlike China, beyond 2018, most floating solar project announcements and tenders will span a diverse covering of India and won't necessarily be specific to one part of the country. So as mentioned earlier, as more floating solar vendors enter the market, costs are expected to come down with increased competition. At the moment, upfront Capex is generally higher than that of ground mount application in the same location and of the same size. And I want to reiterate that Capex, capital expenditure, for floating solar applications is far from standardized. Here you can see reported high and low costs, but it's not as simple to provide a single dollar per watt figure for floating solar projects as it is for a ground-mounted array, for example. And so this is primarily because there are so many factors to take into account for floating solar applications, such as water level variation, extreme weather, such as heavy winds or typhoons, environmental constraints, and the depth of the body of water, also exposure to maybe even wave activity or saltwater, project size and location, and more. So another thing about floating solar when compared to ground-mounted arrays, the breakdown of all-in costs are different. So the module price is typically the biggest cost for ground-mounted arrays, but for floating solar applications, the structural balance of systems, or the SBOS, and the soft costs can exceed the cost of the modules. Similar to other solar PV applications, the larger the floating solar system is, the lower the dollar per watt all-in cost may be. So scale matters when it comes to all-in costs for floating solar applications. And I do want to mention that the US is not a major floating solar market, but I thought it would be interesting to include it here just for comparison purposes. For modules, dual glass modules are most popular for floating solar applications, either framed or frameless, depending on the racking solution used. And there's no cost increase for modules or inverters used on floating solar applications compared to ground mount or roof mount arrays. The electrical balance of systems, or the EBOS, on the other hand, may be more expensive for floating solar applications due to the marine grade cabling that would be required. EBOS costs can be an average of 13% more expensive for floating solar applications compared to a ground mount application of the same size and location. Structural balance of system costs can be an average of 5 times more for a floating solar application compared to a ground mount array of the same size and location. So these costs include the floating solar structure and the mooring and anchoring system. And these costs for SBOS are mostly driven by the floating structure itself, followed by the mooring and anchoring costs. The anchoring and mooring system, it can be more costly if there's increased water level variation, for example, or a deeper body of water. Labor costs may account for an average of 6% of all-in system costs for floating solar applications, which may be less than those for a ground-mounted array of the same size and location. However, skilled labor for floating solar systems may not be as ubiquitous in some countries due to the nascency of the application, so this can affect costs. Other soft costs, such as design and engineering, can vary significantly from holding as little as 1% of all-in system costs all the way up to 15%, depending on the simplicity of the system. So the cost variance for another category of soft costs, such as supply chain and logistics, is largely dependent on the distance from the manufacturing location of all products to the site. Floating structures that include pontoons filled with air may yield high shipping costs, as these products can be voluminous, even if lightweight. So not only is shipping from country to country expensive, but the transit costs within the country to get to the project site can also be expensive, especially if the floating solar site location is remote. The lack of land acquisition costs for floating solar applications can reduce developer costs when compared to a ground-mounted array of the same size and location. And floating solar applications can yield developer costs that are an average of 26% less than those for ground-mount applications. In terms of regional cost differences, the SBOS costs in the US may be higher than other countries in 2019, as there are less floating structure vendors operating in the country, and therefore perhaps less competition and price pressure. But on the other hand, European markets have more floating solar vendors and will likely experience more cost reductions as a result of increased competition compared to the US. So looking at some of the markets specifically, China will have the second lowest cost of all major floating solar markets in Asia in 2019, next to India, largely due to lower labor costs and lower soft costs compared to other countries in Asia. China's average floating solar project size is larger compared to other countries such as Japan, so this may also contribute to a lower dollar per watt figure for all-in construction costs. In Japan, on the other hand, there will be higher all-in costs in 2019 due to the smaller average project size as well as higher component costs. Japan also has higher labor costs compared to other countries such as India, as well as higher supply chain and logistics costs, which increase the overall soft costs. However, Japan's soft costs have potential to come down as there have been many installations thus far, as mentioned previously. So perhaps labor, permitting, and even design and engineering practices will become more streamlined and yield lower all-in costs in the future. All-in costs of floating solar in India will be higher compared to ground-mounted applications of the same size and location in 2019, while India experiences some of the lowest all-in construction costs for floating solar in 2019. The cost of the floating structure and the mooring and anchoring solution will be quite high relative to other cost categories. The cost for these structural balance of systems can be as much as 38 cents a watt, and logistics also remains high in India in 2019, is expected to remain high in 2019 as the transit within the country to get to the site can be expensive, especially if the projects are in remote locations, along with transport of materials into the country. So that's all I have for now, and I'll hand it back to Thomas for some Q&A.
Thanks a lot, Molly. And first of all, thanks for a great presentation. And I wanted to remind the audience to use the question box to send in their questions, not the chat box. And then there are a lot of questions, so let's just jump right away to all the questions. Then first about the land acquisition costs. How does that work exactly, and who are you paying in the case of floating solar, for example, in the US? Are you leasing the water body from the municipality, or how does that work?
Yep, so that's a great question. So it definitely is site specific for the water body itself, and depending on who owns it. So if it's a governing entity, then they would be responsible for either leasing or maybe renting out the water body. Maybe you're acquiring a water body, or maybe you're co-locating a floating solar system where a hydropower facility exists, and so it's a dam that's maybe owned by that facility, or again maybe it's a governing entity. So it really depends on who it will be, and that can vary. But generally speaking, I have heard through a lot of conversations that I've had that those costs for water acquisition or leasing are much lower than the land acquisition costs for a larger ground-mounted array of the same location.
All right, thanks a lot. That's clarifying. And then a question about the IP68 rating. Should the modules and connectors not have such a rating, and how would this affect the cost? Would that be a significant increase of costs?
So you said IT68 rating?
IP68.
IP68. So I think that for the modules and the inverters themselves, so far from what I've heard, there shouldn't be any cost additions for specific for floating solar applications. And so I think for inverters, from most of the conversations I've had with vendors, they're already rated appropriately for floating solar arrays, whether they be installed either at the array on the water or on shore. And the same goes for the modules. Nothing extra needs to be done in the manufacturing process for modules to be deployed on floating solar applications.
All right, that's clarifying. So no significant increase of cost there to expect. And then another question about at least the interaction with land or water owners, and also the permitting. So how long would the process normally take from start till actual finish of construction in the US again?
So speaking in the US specifically, it seems, particularly in the US, and there haven't been as many projects, but the permitting process can actually be quite long, again, depending on the site. But one of the the issues with floating solar in its nascent stage is the unknown environmental impacts, and also installing these applications in areas where there have never been installations such as this. So permitting can actually be longer depending on where it's going to be installed and any complications, and maybe there are extra studies that need to be performed compared to a ground-mounted array where it might be a little less complex. So it can be longer, but again, it can also be just as swift depending on the body of water and if it's going to be a simple installation in if you're comparing a reservoir versus a pond, for example, those permitting process may vary significantly. So again, very site specific, but it can be extremely long, even up to 1 to 2 years, as little as 3 months.
All right, thanks a lot. And before we go on to the next question, I want to answer a question that comes in a lot. The slides will be available. We send out the recordings of this webinar and the slides probably end of this week, early next week. So another question, this one not about the US, that's nice for a change. Do you see a lot of potential for floating solar in Australia? There were some items in the news about floating solar, but is it a significant market, do you think?
Oh, yeah. So that's actually a great question. So I think that there is potential. I mean, so far right now, we've seen there have been projects in Australia. Mostly they've been smaller. There's been, I believe, definitely less than a megawatt. They've been about maybe 30 kilowatts and 100 kilowatts earlier in 2015 and 2017 so far in Australia. But I haven't heard too much about in terms of developers, focusing on Australia in 2019 in particular, but there have been past projects, so it's possible, but I haven't heard it as expected to be a huge market compared to the rest of the Asia Pacific region in the near term.
All right, thank you. And another question about financing. Now that there are more projects coming online, so to say, and there's more experience, do you see a shift in how the projects are financed? Is there, for example, less risk perceived by the banks, and are they more willing to step in?
So yeah, that's another great question. I think so far it seems that, of course, there's still, financiers are going to be risk averse, and I think that there still are some unknowns when it comes to inland floating solar. And so I think that generally, I think that the shift in financing may happen soon in terms of the shift in mentality of financing entities and right now, it seems that generally speaking, what's positive is that some of the technology itself is not new, but rather it's just the application. So in terms of the unknowns in regards to the reliability and the lifespan of the structure itself, we can look to other applications such as docks for boats, even structures that have similar technology that have been deployed for even more than 25 years, which is what you'd expect for the floating solar array. So we can look to other areas where this technology exists in the water, but not necessarily as a floating solar application. But generally speaking, I think that these projects, while some might not be financed or, deployed by utilities or, just no financing structure at all. There are projects that have been financed, and we'll see more and more of that. But I think generally there is still somewhat of the hesitation, but just largely because of the unknowns of the performance and the reliability of the system for the full 25 years.
All right, great. Thanks a lot. And I see a couple of questions coming in about the use of floating solar on hydro reservoirs or hydro dams. And maybe first of all, because there are a lot of questions, do you see that as a big potential market? And how would the cost be affected? Is there a lot of extra cost due to mooring systems because of water variation, or are there less costs because of electrical infrastructure?
Yeah, so that's actually, I'm glad you brought this up. So for floating solar arrays co-located with hydropower dams, I do think there's a lot of potential, and a lot of the installations so far have been co-located with hydropower dams. So a couple things. The first, in terms of cost. So of course, the water level variation that can, definitely increase the mooring and the anchoring costs. So they have to be flexible enough to handle that kind of variation. And so that does impose a cost. However, when it comes to interconnection and going through that process, with hydro dams, the interconnection infrastructure already exists, so that actually could save time and costs on the other hand. But generally, I do think that the understanding the reciprocity at play, floating solar projects may be much smaller than the total power capacity of a hydropower dam. So while there is potential for floating solar to kind of, for floating solar to work during the times when the hydropower is not producing, then they can sort of act in this reciprocal manner as well, just as an added benefit. But the floating solar array would need to be big enough in order to do this. But that is a great question.
All right, thanks a lot. That's clarifying. One note from my side: this will be a specific topic at the conference. There are a lot of questions coming in about these hydro-connected floating systems, and I think there's indeed a lot of potential, and it will be discussed extensively at the conference. And then another topic that I see coming back a lot in the questions. I'm afraid we cannot go over all the questions as they are coming in really a lot, about standardization. The market is evolving quite rapidly, and there seems to be a lack of standardization. And do you already see some working groups existing, or who's taking care of this?
Yeah, so that's a good question. In terms of standardization, speaking about the product specifically, and then maybe I'll speak to the standardization of cost, but the standardization, there seems to be, as mentioned, just more, market entrants, manufacturers that have unique solutions for the floating solar application. So I'm not familiar with any particular working groups that are focused on standardization in this regard. I think that the industry is definitely in its nascent stage, and so understanding what works and what doesn't work is still at play here. But that definitely is an interesting. That's definitely something that's interesting, to keep in mind, and I'll definitely keep that on the radar and understand, what efforts are being done. And then I guess when it comes to cost standardization, there's still a wide range of costs, depending on some of the factors discussed, environmental factors, size, location. So there's not there, I don't see in the near term standardization, sort of coming into effect, but definitely we'll keep this on the radar.
All right, thanks a lot. And then another question about more or less the standardization, but I think your first slide showed a couple of vendors already, but there are a lot of companies entering this market, and there might be a rise of low cost but also low quality systems. Do you see that as a threat for the market? For example, if some of these systems break down, get some bad publicity, could that be a barrier to further grow the market?
So yeah, that's a great question. I think, taking a step back, not even just for floating solar, but for really any application, even ground mounted arrays, roof mounted arrays, other types of solar. It's really, any kind of, poor quality system. Maybe there's some bad PR. Of course, it has the potential to be detrimental to a market, especially floating solar in its nascent stage. Mitigating any risk to growth and any kind of bad PR would be ideal, but I do think that there is a lot of focus on quality, and while some markets in particular are driven by cost, I think that for the most part, the focus really is on the quality of the product and not so much producing, a cheaper quality product. I don't know if the market is there yet on a global scale, so I think in the meantime, it seems that quality is really the priority for floating solar.
Exactly. All right. Thank you. And then back to the Capex cost. And you already mentioned that there are a lot of factors influencing the cost of floating solar. But how big is the factor of the system size? Are smaller systems really a lot more expensive, or is it comparable?
So yeah, that's a great question. I think I was muted. The dollar per watt can be smaller the larger system, but with a smaller system, because the upfront materials cost can be more than a ground mounted array, it seems that a 1 megawatt system is the minimum to sort of have the economics of the project work well. And of course that depends on site and location, but generally if you have projects that are much smaller, the all-in Capex dollar per watt will be larger. But one of the factors is depending on the body of water, and if it's going to be in an inland location, but let's say if it's in a lagoon and might have some exposure to wave activity, and might need to be resistant to any kind of especially if you have extreme weather, larger arrays might be more resistant to battling any kind of water level variation or extreme weather. And so smaller arrays might have higher upfront costs. Maybe there's more on the mooring and anchoring side that needs to be done in order to install that smaller array. So if you think about it, the larger organism is better suited to handle maybe more like wave activity, extreme weather events, because it's larger and more suitable in that sense.
All right, thanks. And then another topic that keeps coming back, and maybe good to start off with a first question is bifacial modules. There's a lot of potential and or at least rumors about it, but are you aware of any floating plants using bifacial modules?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There are some. So far, there might be a couple actually that actually do employ the bifacial solar modules. I think that right now the benefits of using bifacial depends on the type of floating structure you're using. So if you have a system that's kind of more transparent and you have the modules maybe having more reflectivity coming from the water as opposed to the platform itself, I think that the from what I've seen, and of course this is still in its nascent stage, and we're unsure of how this is going to pan out over the long term. But in terms of production, I think it might be negligible just compared to a bifacial module when you have a white surface, on the other side. So because of the albedo effect, it might actually be minimal if you have the modules and then on directly over the surface of the water compared to the modules on a let's say a white surface, and maybe the platform of the solar array, the floating structure, if that is in fact, a white surface, then that could be advantageous. So it depends on the kind of floating structure, but there definitely are cases where bifacial modules are employed. In fact, I think in Belgium, by the end of 2019, there's going to be it's a bifacial and also a tracker system, and there's going to be that. So we'll see, how this, how performance really changes using these bifacial modules as, more installations use them. But yeah, there definitely are a couple.
All right, thanks a lot. And so there are also a couple of questions about the OPEX, and I know that's still some work in progress, but maybe a question you could answer the lifetime of the plants, because there are, of course, not a lot of plants already operational for more than, let's say, 5 years. But do you know what the expected lifetime of these plants is?
Yep, that's another great question. So from what I've heard, the standard 25 year, lifetime of the solar panels, and then of course you have other parts of the array like the inverter, which might need to be swapped out before then. But generally, the lifespan of these floating solar arrays, I believe, is expected to still be the 25 years, and I'm not exactly sure in how often or the pontoons themselves or the floating structure platform, depending on the manufacturer and the application, the O&M will definitely vary, and the life expectancy will vary. But I do think that generally the O&M costs will of course vary, but also might be more expensive when compared to a ground-mounted array. But I also think that generally speaking, the overall when looking at the lifetime and how these products will bode, I think looking to other installations such as the docks, for example, that might employ the same kind of pontoon structure, understanding the lifetime of those, and then using lessons learned from that kind of structure for floating solar. So I think there are a lot of unknowns, but I do think that 25 years is the standard that I've been hearing.
All right, and do you know if the model suppliers then also just give the same performance warranty as as installed on ground mounted. So,
yeah, so another question. Oh, yep, continue.
Oh, no, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so as far as I've heard in discussions with manufacturers, module manufacturers, the warranty stays the same, so nothing changes for the floating solar installation.
All right, then maybe for the sake of time, one last question without going into detail on the OPEX, but what are some factors to take in consideration compared to ground-mounted solar when calculating the OPEX? Is the O&M, for example, significantly more expensive? Are there any other surprising factors, the cooling effect of the water? Do you have a list of factors to take into account without going too much detail?
Yeah, so another great point. So generally the O&M costs for the system, again, very site specific, but generally speaking, I think that they could be, if they are going to be higher than that of a ground mount array, some of the factors are that perhaps the visits to the array will need to be more frequent than a ground mounted array. And then depending on how far the floating solar array is from shore, if you're taking a boat and, the means of transit just to get to the array may be costly. But then the frequency, depends on where you are. So if you have an area, one of the O&M, issues that I've been hearing a lot is, bird droppings can be an issue and definitely, put a damper on the production. And so if you have kind of a self-cleaning mechanism, then that can be great for the solar array. But otherwise, if you need to go and clean the solar array more frequently as a result, then that can be an issue. So I think that, again, site specific, but generally speaking, if it's closer to shore, and if it's in an area, and maybe there aren't as extreme weather events, or if you are able to access it more quickly, then of course costs might be lower. Some of the ways to reduce costs is, if you can assess which modules might be losing production, onshore before going out to the array. That can help reduce overall costs and save time. So there are ways to do that, but generally there still remain some unknowns with the all-in O&M and operating costs of these systems.
All right, thanks a lot. And then Molly, there are a lot of questions still coming in. Your email address is on the screen. Is it okay if people with urgent questions contact you directly?
Yep, that sounds great.
Great. And you're also attending the Floating Solar Conference, even speaking there. So for the people attending there, they can also just ask you the questions there on the 19th of September, right?
That's great. Yep.
Yes, so then thanks a lot for today's super interesting webinar. And I also want to thank everyone who attended today's webinar. And one last time, the 19th of September, the Floating Solar Conference will happen in Amsterdam. I saw a lot of questions coming in also about different topics than just the economics of floating solar. So we'll have 25 speakers with expertise and experience in all these various fields of floating solar. There will be over 200 attendees from all over the world. So I would encourage you to take at least a look at the website, at the program, and hope to see all of you there the 19th of September in Amsterdam. And then one last thank you to you, Molly, for a great presentation today. And thanks for watching this webinar to all attendees.
Thanks so much, Thomas. Thanks, everyone.